What even is elevated horror? Well, to those who use the term unironically, it describes a specific group of horror films and stories that focus less on creative, inventive, and gory kills, and instead aim to use the conventions of horror to explore broader social issues such as class, race, gender, and power. These films are viewed as a form of social critique, and they tend to focus on themes, motifs, and symbolism. This is often considered a more subtle and nuanced approach to creating a sense of dread and horror in your audience, and these films are often considered more serious and artistic than your typical slasher film. While elevated horror is a newer term that's applied to a very specific subset of films under the broader umbrella of horror, I believe, and I know I'm not alone in this, a lot of people feel the same way, that horror has used some of these same elements of storytelling since its beginning and continues to do so, and that the very term elevated horror is in and of itself ridiculous, elitist nonsense. And in this video, I'm going to focus on one particular slasher film to explain why I believe that it would be just as deserving of the title of elevated horror as any A24 film. That film is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is often disregarded in discussion of elevated horror as an example of the type of horror that these films are attempting to differentiate themselves from. But in reality, it would fit squarely into the subgenre if it were in fact anything more than a vanity label created solely for marketing purposes. And in this video, I'm going to explain why I believe that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is anything but a shallow slasher attempting to shock and scare audiences with cheap thrills and graphic violence, and in fact, uses the lens of horror to examine and critique social issues more effectively than many so-called elevated horror films. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released in 1974 and is often cited as one of the most groundbreaking and influential horror films of all time. The film was directed by Tobe Hooper, who was able, through the film's raw and realistic aesthetic, masterful use of tension and suspense, and powerful social commentary to create an eerie and unsettling atmosphere that's kept viewers on the edge of their seat since it was released. The film continues to be a favorite among horror fans and is considered a classic of the genre. The film was shot on a low budget and with minimal special effects, which gives the film a sense of realism and immersion that's often lacking from higher budget horror films. Additionally, the use of handheld cameras and documentary-style filming techniques add to the sense of realism and make the viewer feel as though they are a part of the action rather than a casual observer. Set in rural Texas in the 1970s, the film explores themes of the exploitation of the working class in rural America, as well as mistrust of outsiders, which reflects the type of tribal mentality that has plagued American society since its founding. And these issues, which the film addresses through the lens of horror, continue to haunt us even now, nearly 50 years after the film's initial release. However, these issues are often ignored by corporate-run media outlets who foster and nurture such divisions using sensationalist fear-mongering tactics to draw in viewers and are controlled by corporations with a vested financial interest in promoting certain ideologies and political agendas, distracting from the real issues in American society and seeking to sow division among the working class through the use of divide and conquer tactics, deliberately creating divisions among the poor through propaganda designed to promote feelings of resentment and mistrust between different groups of people based on factors such as race, ethnicity, religion, or nationality. These tactics make it harder for the poor to unite and fight back against our corporate overlords, thus enabling the exploitation of the working class to continue on undeterred. During the 1970s, there was a decline in small-town America as a result of industrialization and the rise of suburbanization. Industrialization led to the growth of factories and manufacturing centers in urban areas, drawing people and jobs away from rural and small-town communities and into cities and suburbs. Another major factor that led to the decline of small-town America during this time was the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs, as companies sought to cut costs and increase profits by moving the factories to other countries in search of cheaper labor. Many small towns lost their main source of employment and economic stability, which led to the decline of population as residents left in search of work, and it also meant that small towns were unable to draw new businesses to their communities to replace the jobs that had been lost. The effects of this population shift on small towns is very effectively and eerily portrayed in the film, with one of the most striking elements of the film's social commentary being the portrayal of the cannibalistic Sawyer family at the center of the story. The family, who live in isolation and survive by preying on unsuspecting travelers, can be read as a metaphor for how society devours and discards its citizens. While Leatherface is the most recognizable character from the film and is a terrifying and enigmatic figure whose appearance and motivations are never clearly explained, adding to the unease and horror not only of the characters within the film, but also of the audience, the film is not primarily about him, but rather it's about the cannibalistic family that he's a part of. The film focuses on the family as a whole and the various roles and dynamics within it, rather than just on the singular figure of Leatherface. The film also explores themes of power dynamics within the family. The family members are shown as manipulative, ruthless, and in control of the situation. They use their resources to exploit and control the outsiders, and the viewer can see how the family functions as a unit to keep the outsiders in check. Additionally, the film explores the theme of mental illness and its effect on the family dynamic. Some of the family members are depicted as having mental illnesses, which plays a role in their behavior and is an essential element of the story. Leatherface, in particular, is depicted as having a cognitive and developmental disorder, which is suggested by his abnormal behavior, childlike mannerisms, and lack of verbal communication. He's often shown wearing masks made from human skin, an act which implies a dissociative disorder. But Leatherface is not the only character depicted as having a mental illness. The entire family is isolated from the rest of society, which can imply a disconnection from reality, a symptom of mental illness. The film uses the family's mental illness as a reason to explain their abhorrent behavior and creates a sense of unease as the audience immediately recognizes the family's actions as irrational, displaying socially inappropriate, impulsive, and dangerous behavior with frequent mood swings and fits of agitation and hostility, not only towards their intended victims, but towards each other. Moreover, the film uses the isolation and desolation of the farmhouse where the family lives as a metaphor for the isolation that people with mental illness sometimes experience. The farmhouse is portrayed as a decaying and dilapidated structure, which can symbolize the deterioration of the family's mental state. The infamous family dinner scene, in which the Sawyers are gathered together to share a meal, functions as a sort of group therapy session. It's chaotic and disorganized, with several members of the family shouting and talking over one another. It's reminiscent of the dinner scene from Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, which was itself a critique of the treatment of mental illness in the 19th century, highlighting the inhumane and ineffective practices that were used and the power dynamics that existed in the treatment of mental illness. Poe uses grotesque imagery and dark humor to convey the absurdity and horror of the situation, and the dinner scene in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre highlights similar themes about the lack of treatment for those suffering from mental illness issues in our modern society, particularly in poor and rural communities. That's not to say that the film portrays mental illness in anything even approaching a realistic way. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre portrays mentally ill persons as dangerous and violent, which contributes to the established misunderstanding of mental illness that are far too prevalent in our society. The archetype of crazy killers in this film and in countless others exploits the lack of understanding that people already have by presenting a narrative in which these individuals are threatening or scary. It's part of a much larger issue with the portrayal of mental illness in media, an issue which recent so-called elevated horror films are not immune from, and which is harmful because it ultimately has real-world consequences, as these negative stereotypes often affect the way that people perceive those with mental health disorders in the real world,
as their only experience with mental illness may be through these films, and such misunderstandings give them reason to be afraid and to avoid such individuals, when the truth is that mental illness does not predict dangerousness, nor is it inherently correlated with dangerousness, and people with mental illness should be treated with compassion and not with fear. I'm not trying to single out the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in this regard. This is an extremely widespread issue, but I can't ignore the fact that this film, as well as countless others, is guilty of this, and we can and should do better. Moving the characters outside the family, the film portrays the character of Sally Hardesty, played by Marilyn Burns, as a victim of severe trauma. Throughout the film, Sally is subjected to a series of terrifying and violent events, and her reactions to these events are used to show the psychological impacts of trauma. The film portrays Sally's trauma in several different ways. Sally is initially depicted as a happy and carefree person, but as soon as the group of friends stumbles upon the family of cannibals, her demeanor changes. She becomes visibly anxious and afraid. Her body language reflects this tension, and she can be seen constantly looking around and being hyper-aware of the danger she finds herself facing. Her fear is palpable and is portrayed as a visceral reaction that's difficult to control. Another way the film shows Sally's trauma is through her vulnerability. Throughout the film, Sally is physically and emotionally assaulted by Leatherface and his family. She's held captive, beaten, and nearly killed several times. Her vulnerability is emphasized through her screams, her pleas for mercy, and her sense of hopelessness. Her screams are meant to evoke empathy in the viewer, making the audience feel the weight of her trauma alongside her. Additionally, the film focuses on Sally's sense of powerlessness throughout the ordeal. The family of cannibals hold all of the power in the film. They control Sally's fate, and her pleas for help are ignored. The viewer can sense the helplessness that Sally feels, and it is this helplessness that makes her ordeal all the more terrifying. Finally, the film shows Sally's trauma through her intense emotional reaction after the event. The film doesn't reveal anything about what Sally's life is like after this traumatic event, but the closing scene shows her in a car laughing hysterically. This scene implies the lifelong impact of her trauma and the emotional toll of her experience. It suggests that even though she has physically escaped from the situation, she still bears the scars of her trauma. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not just a horror film, but also a powerful social commentary about American society. The depiction of the cannibalistic family, the exploitation of the working class, and mistrust towards outsiders reflect the darker aspects of American society and illustrates how societal issues can lead to violence and tragedy. If the inclusion of these themes aren't enough to raise the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to the level of elevated horror, then I don't know what is. Alright, well, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, can you please hit the like button? You can also subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, and turn on notifications to be updated whenever I upload a new video. And until next time, keep on creeping on.